Hello, this is Father Bill Watson, and this is a question for our YouTube channel, Ask Father Bill. We've been looking at the issue of discernment from different perspectives. This perspective is discernment and the dark night of the spirit, one of those great classic mystical phrases, the dark night of the spirit. I used to think when I was much younger, if I was in the dark night of the spirit, then I realized that you've got to be a lot holier to get there. But we're going to talk about it anyway in light of discernment. Because so much of the faith is both so simple and deeply complex. The mystery of the Trinity being perhaps the prime example. Theology of the Holy Trinity can be as complex as astrophysics, yet it is the most simple of realities. Three totally distinct persons, yet fully open to the giving and the receiving of love. It is this complete giving and receiving of love with no barriers that makes them one. God is three, God is love, and God is one in love. And as we hear in John's Gospel, Jesus says, "May you be one as the Father and I are one." Because we are made in the image and likeness of God. We're distinct, but we're called to give and receive love completely. And that will happen one day again in the kingdom to come, because original sin has kind of messed things up with regards to human giving and receiving of love. But the mystical theology of the dark night of the spirit can be equally as complex, yet it is very simple as well. The dark night of the spirit is the identity void experienced when God's grace enables one to surrender one's own will as the guide star of one's life for the divine will. And the surrendering of one's will involves the necessary and oftentimes harrowing deconstruction of false ego identities that one narcissistically clung to for their meaning. Let's take St. Ignatiuss of Loyola as an example. Pride, wealth, family status, military prowess, valor in battle, and a reflexive faith were part of Ignatius's noble breeding. He identified these characteristics of his upbringing later as riches, honor, and pride. When Ignatius was 16 years old, his father Beltran died. And upon the death of his father, as was custom, all the family wealth, all the prestige, and all the property passed to Ignatius's oldest brother. Ignatius, now alone in the world, must fight for a place of honor befitting the Loyola name and temperament. He had no intention of serving the church. Instead, he would seek to make his mark serving the king and achieving military glories. Lots of material here for false ego identities. So Ignatius Loyola describes his own false ego identities and narcissistic pride in the opening lines of the autobiography. It says, quote, "Until the age of 26, he was a man given to the vanities of the world, and his chief delight used to be in the exercise of arms with a great and vain desire to gain honor," end of quote. Ignatius's pride was on full display as he persuaded the commander of the Spanish forces, against the will of all the other knights, to engage the Battle of Pamplona against thousands of much more well-armed French, where he suffered a broken leg, which led to his conversion, and his pride would also be on full display as he navigated the spiritual purification in his struggle with scrupulosity over his obsessive confessing of past sins that ultimately broke that pride. Ignatius received grace to both see and cease his obsessive confession habit. In doing so, his pride was both exposed and broken. When he identified scruples as rooted in pride, Ignatius identified his core sin. Christian tradition has described pride or narcissism as the chief vice, Rereading the first paragraph of his autobiography with fresh eyes, we hear a man describing himself in painfully stark language. He was filled with overweening pride. Pride caused his Pamplona battle injury, and pride caused the terrible scrupulosity that tormented him for months, causing him to contemplate taking his own life, throwing himself off the cliff from the place he prayed because he was so angry he couldn't purify himself. Months of hard labor, severe fasts, agonizing self-doubts, and fearsome spiritual and psychological trials, all linked to his scruples, ran their course. He had explored every avenue, sought the best spiritual advice, and maximized every act of will to master and control his sinful memories. Yet he was unable to find a solution or gain release from this fearsome and damaging habit. He knew it was doing him damage, but he couldn't stop it. It's just at this point when Ignatius felt like an utter failure that grace has opened his heart and mind to the most important insight of his life. This turned out to be the most vital juncture in his conversion journey. What no effort of his own could achieve came to him from the Lord as if, he says, if awakening him from sleep, as if from a dream. Grace awakened Ignatius to investigate the vehement spirit of disgust, compelling him to end his spiritual journey and just go back to court. With a profound economy of words, Ignatius expressed the insight which led him to the most important discernment of his life. He determined, he said with great clarity, never again to confess sins from the past. When one is graced to surrender the false self and prideful self-will that defines one's life, a void, sometimes quite frightful, is experienced. It is a dark night of the spirit, where a new Christ-centered identity must supplant the false identity of one's sinful narcissism. And this is where discernment is crucial. In the frightful void between the crumbling of a false self and before the new person in Christ is solidified, there is tremendous pressure exerted by the enemy of our human nature and our old sinful past to rush in and to fill the void with something, with anything. Don't rush. Allow the Spirit to lead. Sit in the void. Ignatius's determination to conquer his sinfulness by force of his own will failed. His autobiography's terse narrative hides the magnitude of the spiritual and psychological transformation in Ignatius. The transformation is stark. Ignatius moved from managing his spiritual growth with the same swagger that he waged the Battle of Pamplona, and became a man of much greater humility, willing to be led like a boy at the hands of a schoolmaster, he said in his autobiography. Many can experience these dark nights of the spirit, these major identity crises, when having achieved their greatest success, however they define success, find it doesn't bring them happiness, peace, or hope. Discernment is necessary at these times. For these are times to turn to God for assistance and not to double down on trying harder to achieve what did not in the past bring peace or happiness. It takes humility and the grace of God to allow one to experience and finally admit that the way we organized our lives was centered on a false self and not on God, what I like to call not founded on our true heart. As we confront these false selves at deeper and deeper levels, we will have these identity crises, these dark nights, as God works to align our loves and our lives more to His kingdom. What is important to always note is that the work of conversion that slowly transforms our self-centeredness to selflessness is God's grace working in us. And all these dark nights of the spirit, where false selves are unmasked, will lead eventually, by grace, to the new person God will make of us. And God's going to do that work. So let's end with St. Paul speaking to the Galatians. Paul, who tried everything to do things perfectly, finally had to admit that the law was not going to save him. And this is what he says in Galatians. For through the law I died to the law, that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, yet I live no longer I, but Christ lives in me. Insofar as I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who has loved me and given himself up for me. And I hope this discernment of the dark night of the Spirit is helpful.